Hello class, this is Mr. Howard. The objective for this video is to briefly unpack section 2, dealing with the three imperial areas within ancient Africa that we highlighted at the end of section 1, dealing specifically with Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, these three prominent empires within ancient Africa. So let's go ahead and just dive in to ancient Africa in relation to the Imperial threesome of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. Now, when we're talking about these three major areas, we have to consider a few things. All right. Number one, when we're talking about the power and the dominance of these three areas, we have to first look at the location in which they're connected to. All right, they're located in the western region of Africa, and their reign over Africa pretty much spanned from 300 BC to about 1594 AD. When the Moroccans came in to invade the Songhai Empire. So make sure you highlight that. Make sure you write that down in your notes that from 300 BC to 1594 AD, these three major empires within Western Africa was very dominant and very widespread in their influence throughout other parts of Africa, especially when we start talking about trade within the domestic regions of Africa. Now, this imperial threesome ruled for almost 2,000 years, so make sure you write that down in your notes and highlight that they ruled for almost 200 years. And one of the critical elements that you have to consider is their ability to establish a firm grip on their political infrastructure, their cultural organization, and their militaristic strength. All right, so make sure you have those three components also listed in your notes as well. Now, obviously, if you have such prominent and dominant um, rule over a particular area, that requires very capable and very efficient leaders who possess a great deal of savvy, possess a great deal of acumen when it comes to both political and cultural affairs, and also how to effectively delegate your responsibilities in terms of military to qualified military leaders. All right. So when we're talking about some of the greatest emperors in African history, you'll find that most of them are connected to Mali or the Malian Empire. Emperors such as Sundiata, Mansa Musa, which you guys covered last week in your crash course video, and Abubakari, which is another prominent leader who is really credited for his leadership, as well as we begin to see him in section 3 dealing with African explorers, okay, as well, in terms of the African presence in America. All right, so definitely something to remember. Now, let's go ahead and break down these three empires. Now, as early as the 7th century AD, Ghana had developed the following. All right. First things first, they established a very strong culture. The pathology of their cultural organization was very much evident within Ghana during this time period. And a strong element of that culture really resided in the African principles that was established throughout many portions of not just Ghana, but also it spread throughout other portions of Africa. And so, in essence, you can look at Ghana as kind of like the blueprint empire that other smaller kingdoms throughout Africa would follow. This will be somewhat equivalent to going back to Greece, our study of Greece, when we were talking about Athens being the school of Greece, being the blueprint of Greece for other Greek city states to kind of follow and mimic as the proper example of what a democratic state looks like, well, Ghana in this same context will be considered kind of, they would be placed in that mold. They would be considered kind of like the blueprint or school of Africa or the school of West Africa, more specifically. All right, so make sure you keep that in mind. Also, the traditions that united the entire coast of West Africa actually gathered its footing in Ghana. Okay, so make sure you mark those points down. Make sure you definitely have the 7th century AD highlighted and marked down in your notes. You will need to know that for your quiz. Okay, there's going to be a question asking you during which time period did Ghana develop these subsequent elements of their empire. Now, the Malian Empire, of the three, the Malian Empire was by far the most famous empire of West Africa. Okay, we find that in 1255 AD. Make sure you highlight that. Make sure you write that down. That the Malian Empire was the most famous, and in 1255, this is where we begin to see the Malian kingdom established itself as the lead economic base within all of West Africa. This is due in large part to Mali serving as the epicenter of trade, as well as intellectual attraction for Arabs and the Portuguese. This kind of, just to provide a quick connection point, this kind of reminds us of Constantinople. Okay, going back to our study of the Byzantine Empire, Constantinople being recognized as the kind of like the epicenter of the religious faith of the Christian faith, but also an epicenter of trade and intellectual stimulation. All right, we see that same concept in Mali as this very strong presence within West Africa. And if you look at the map of Africa, you would notice that Mali is somewhat in the center of West Africa. So you can make the argument that they're kind of like the crossroads, if you will. If you want to get to a certain portion of Africa, of West Africa, you have to go through Mali. Okay. Make sure you also have marked down that the Arabs as well as the Portuguese were two primary trading partners for the Malian Empire. So make sure you mark that down. Now, militaristically, they were the strongest empire. Make sure you have that marked down. The Malian Empire also possessed the strongest army in Western Africa during this time period. And also, a lot of this can be attributed to the truth and the fact that they were deeply influenced by the success as well as the blueprint that was laid by the Ghanaian Empire. Okay, so make sure you mark that down. Make sure you highlight that the Malian Empire was deeply influenced by the Ghanaian Empire. Okay. Now, the Malian Empire did decline, however, in the 15th century. Make sure you write that down in your notes, mainly because it was unable to maintain the level of rebellion that was beginning to unfold on a progressive basis amongst the smaller kingdoms. A lot of the smaller kingdoms grew somewhat envious of the control, of the power, of the influence, of the access that the Malian Empire and its respective kings had over West Africa. For example, you guys watched a video last week on Mansa Musa. Mansa Musa, by far, is considered one of the richest rulers of all time, with an estimated net worth of roughly $400 billion at that time, which is unheard of. So we begin to see how effective the Malian Empire was economically, militaristically, as well as their heightened degree of organization politically. All right. However, there's still just one empire. And over time, we begin to see a lot of rebellion taking place due to the taxes that these smaller kingdoms had to pay to the Malian Empire. As a result, these empires, well, not empires, but more so smaller kingdoms, they begin to send troops to gradually wear down the Malian Empire, which then resulted into Um, Another realm, I would say, of influence that began to unfold throughout the Malian Empire. When I say another realm of influence, this is what I mean. Is that this is where we begin to see a shift, a paradigm shift in leadership, okay, within West Africa. All right. So when Sunni Ali Bed came to power as a minor king in 1464, make sure you write that down in your notes. Mansa Musa was actually the emperor of all of Mali. He was the emperor of the entire Malian Empire. But due to the rebellions that were launched by gentlemen such as Sunni Ali Bed and the kingdom of Gao, all right, many of these smaller kingdoms begin to somewhat come together and systematically and gradually wear down the mighty Malian Empire. As a result, this is where we see the introduction of the Songhai Empire as the ruler, as the lead empire of West Africa. However, their leadership of um, the West African region, all right, was somewhat short lived compared to other empires such as Ghana and Mali, for they only ruled for roughly probably about 130 years. All right. So when you look at the Songhai Empire, they were actually invaded by the Moroccans in 1594. So make sure you note that in your notes. Make sure you write that down in your notes. All right, that the Moroccans are credited for the destruction of the Songhai Empire, and they continued to occupy that area for a while. Now, unfortunately, when we look at the fall of the Songhai Empire, the reason why I bring this up is because myself, along with many other historians, believe fervently that when the Songhai Empire fell, this pretty much marked the end of Africa as an independent nation. Okay, because once the Songhai Empire left the entire west region of Africa unprotected due to its fall to the Moroccans, okay, in 1594, this is where we really begin to see Western nations progressively and systemically exploit and invade these western portions of Africa, which then spilled over into their invasion into other parts of Africa, both north, south, and east, and even central Africa. Okay, so make sure you highlight that the fall of the Songhai Empire is what left the entire west region of Africa unprotected. Now, let's unpack the Western invasion before we close. All right. Now, when we look at the Western invasion, we have to look at a few things. Number one, as we indicated in the previous slide, there was a very um, low level of protection that was afforded to the Western region of Africa once the Songhai Empire fell to the Moroccans in 1594. All right, so due to this lack of quality protection, this is where a lot of European nations begin to easily invade certain sections of the African coast, especially the West Coast. All right. But let's go ahead and stick a pin in that and take a quick step back because roughly 100 years after, all right, the first European invasion in 1441 AD, Africans actually were very much present in many portions of the Western Hemisphere as indentured servants or enslaved people. So when you look at slavery itself, um, we really begin to see progressive elements of slavery and indentured servitude begin to unfold, okay, in earlier portions of the 1400s. All right, so early to mid 1400s, we begin to see this going um, all the way through until roughly, if you want to be honest, about 1863. when you're talking about the Emancipation Proclamation when you include America into the fold. Obviously, the British slave trade was abolished in the latter part of the 1700s. All right, but yes, very much so. We began to see that slavery was indeed present during this time period. As a result, the enslavement of Africans would become one of the keys to the industrialization of not only Europe, but also America. All right. So when we look at the first Africans that arrived in Jamestown, Virginia in 1619, make sure you write that down in your notes. You will need to remember that. Um, they actually were aboard a Dutch ship. However, this is one thing that is oftentimes misunderstood is that they were not the first Africans to grace the American shore. Okay, in fact, in the next section, we're going to be unpacking African explorers before we get into section 4 dealing with slavery. But section 3 is going to be briefly unpacking African explorers and the African presence in America many years before this, all right, before 1619. All right, so Africans already visited the Americas actually roughly 500 years earlier. And if you want to include the Olmec civilization in Mexico, it was many centuries before that. All right, so we begin to see that in Americas such as North, South, Central, as well as Mexico, we begin to see Africans very much present, active, and really establishing things within these respective areas during this time period. Okay, so that concludes section 2. All right. Make sure you also notate the Caribbean or the West Indies as well in your notes in connection to the Americas. All right. Um, that pretty much wraps up section 2. Our next lecture is going to be on section 3, dealing with African explorers, masters of their own destiny. Take care. God bless.